November 24, 1944. Imperial Naval Headquarters, Tokyo, Japan. Commander Yuki Tanaka's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she reviewed the damage reports from the previous night's raid. She was one of only 3 female intelligence officers in the entire Imperial Navy, a position she'd earned through relentless dedication and a photographic memory that had proven invaluable. But nothing in her training had prepared her for what she was reading. American B-29 Superfortress bombers had struck the Nakajima aircraft plant outside Tokyo from an altitude of 30,000 feet in broad daylight with apparent impunity. The report stated that 111 bombers had participated. 111. She read the number 3 times, certain there must be an error. Japan's entire long-range bomber force couldn't muster half that number for a single mission, and these weren't small aircraft. Intelligence estimates put each B-29 at over 99 feet long with a wingspan of 141 feet. These were flying fortresses that dwarfed anything in the Japanese arsenal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What disturbed Commander Tanaka most wasn't just the scale of the attack, it was the casualness of it. American bomber crews had flown 1,500 miles from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, struck their targets in daylight, and returned home. The psychological implications were staggering. While Japanese pilots were being trained to die in single suicide missions, carefully hoarding fuel for one-way flights, American crews were conducting round-trip missions of 3,000 miles as if it were routine training exercise. She pulled out a map and measured the distance herself, using the brass dividers that had belonged to her father, himself a naval officer who had died at Midway. From Saipan to Tokyo and back, 3,002 miles. The fuel requirements alone seemed impossible. Her calculations showed that each bomber must carry more fuel than an entire squadron of Japanese fighters could access in a week. The first B-29 raid on Tokyo had occurred just the day before, on November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day in America. Their defensive armament destroyed interceptors before they could close to effective range. Their formation discipline never wavered despite anti-aircraft fire. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to have unlimited fuel. Colonel Hiroshi Yamamoto, chief of Tokyo Air Defense, was summoned to explain how American bombers could strike the capital with such impunity. Yamamoto was a proud man, a veteran of the China campaigns, and his humiliation was evident as he addressed the assembled intelligence officers. "Our fighters can reach their altitude," he admitted, his voice tight with frustration. "But by the time we climb to 30,000 feet, our pilots are exhausted, our engines are straining, and we have perhaps 5 minutes of combat time before fuel concerns force us to descend. The Americans fly at that altitude as if it were sea level. They maintain formation, they take evasive action, they fight back with coordinated fire. It's as if altitude cost them nothing." Commander Tanaka asked the question everyone was thinking, but afraid to voice. How is that possible? How can they operate so easily at altitudes where our aircraft can barely function? Yamamoto's answer was devastating in its simplicity. Their engines are supercharged far beyond anything we can manufacture. Their fuel is higher quality than anything we possess. Their pilots train at high altitude until it becomes natural. And most importantly, they have so much of everything, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, that they can afford to use it lavishly. We conserve every drop of fuel, every bullet. They spend without counting. The implications cascaded through Commander Tanaka's analysis like falling dominoes. If American bombers could strike Tokyo at will, then every factory, every port, every military installation in Japan was vulnerable. The home islands, which Japanese propaganda had assured the public were impregnable, were actually defenseless against an enemy with sufficient resources and technology. She began pulling archived intelligence reports, looking for warnings that might have been missed. What she found was even more disturbing. The signs had been there for years, but institutional pride had prevented proper analysis. In 1942, Captured American technical manuals described aircraft capabilities the Japanese engineers had dismissed as propaganda. In 1943, reconnaissance photos showed American industrial expansion that military analysts had classified as implausible exaggeration. In early 1944, interrogation reports from captured American aircrew described training programs and supply systems that seemed too efficient to be real. Every warning had been discounted because accepting the truth would mean admitting that Japan was fighting an unwinnable war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The B-29 Superfortress itself represented a technological achievement that Japan couldn't match. Commander Tanaka obtained classified documents that detailed what intelligence services had learned about the aircraft. Maximum speed, 357 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 31,850 feet. Range with bomb load, 3,250 miles. Defensive armament, 12 50-caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets, plus one 20mm cannon. Bomb capacity, 20,000 pounds. Each specification was beyond anything Japan could produce. But it wasn't just one miracle aircraft. America was building them by the hundreds.
Lieutenant Hayashi brought her a decoded American radio transmission that had been intercepted by a signals intelligence unit. The transmission was routine traffic between a B-29 base in the Marianas and headquarters in Guam. It casually mentioned that 17 new B-29s had arrived that week to replace aircraft rotated back to the United States from major overhauls. 17 in 1 week, to one base. Japan's entire aircraft industry were struggling to produce 17 fighters per week across all manufacturers. America was replacing heavy bombers at a rate that exceeded Japan's total production of all aircraft types. The psychological warfare aspect of the B-29 raids was equally devastating. Commander Tanaka interviewed civilians who had witnessed the November 24th raid, the second major attack on Tokyo. A factory worker named Meriko Sato described watching the bombers pass overhead in perfect formation. They flew so high they looked like silver crosses in the sky, Meriko said, her voice still trembling days later. Our fighters went up to stop them, and we could see the contrails, white lines against the blue. But the fighters couldn't reach them. They'd climb and climb, and then they'd have to turn back. The bombers just kept going, straight and level, like they owned the sky. And we realized they did own it. There was nothing we could do. That realization, that feeling of helplessness, was spreading through Tokyo's civilian population faster than any official propaganda could counter it. People who had believed Japanese spirit would overcome American material advantage were confronting evidence that spirit couldn't reach 30,000 feet. Morale, which had already been damaged by defeats in the Pacific, began to crumble under the weight of visible proof that Japan's cities were defenseless. Commander Tanaka compiled a report that she knew would be unwelcome at headquarters. She documented the technical specifications of the B-29, the impossibility of effective defense with current Japanese capabilities, and the implications for civilian morale. Her conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The appearance of B-29 bombers over Japan represents a fundamental shift in the strategic situation. These aircraft demonstrate American industrial and technological superiority in terms impossible to dismiss as propaganda. Japanese air defenses cannot effectively counter aircraft operating at these altitudes with these capabilities. The psychological impact on the civilian population may prove more damaging than the physical destruction caused by the raids themselves. Her superior, Captain Takeshi Nakamura, read her report in silence, his face darkening with each page. When he finished, he set it down carefully, as if the paper itself were dangerous. "This report cannot be distributed," he said quietly. It cannot be filed in the regular intelligence system. It cannot even be acknowledged to exist." "Why not, sir?" Commander Tanaka asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because it tells the truth, and the truth is unacceptable." His candor surprised her. Captain Nakamura had always been a rigid adherent to military protocol and official optimism. But something in the B-29 raids had cracked his certainty. He walked to the window and looked out at Tokyo's skyline, still largely intact, but now living under the shadow of American air power.
"When the Emperor asked me yesterday how we would defend the capital, I had no answer," he admitted. "I could explain what we were trying, the fighter interceptors, the anti-aircraft batteries, the warning systems, but I couldn't promise they would work because we both knew they wouldn't. The Americans have created an aircraft that makes our defenses obsolete. They fly higher than we can effectively reach, faster than we can intercept, and in numbers we cannot match. And they're just beginning." That last statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Just beginning. If this was merely the start of the American bombing campaign, what would the end look like? Commander Tanaka thought about the intelligence estimates for American B-29 production. Current projections suggested the United States would have over 1,000 B-29s operational by mid-1945. 1,000 aircraft, each capable of carrying 10 tons of bombs 3,000 miles. The mathematical implications for Japanese cities were apocalyptic. The next major raid came on November 27th, just 3 days after the previous attack. 81 B-29s struck Tokyo again, this time targeting the dock areas and industrial facilities near the harbor. The raid occurred in daylight, from high altitude, and once again Japanese defenses proved largely ineffective. Fighter pilots who attempted interception reported the same frustrating experience. "By the time we reached their altitude, we were at the absolute limit of our aircraft's performance," one pilot told Commander Tanaka during debriefing. "The engines were screaming, the controls were mushy, and I was gasping for oxygen, even with my mask on. Then I looked at the American bombers, and they were flying in perfect formation, not struggling at all. Their gunners tracked me smoothly and opened fire while I was still trying to line up a shot. I dove away before they could hit me, but I knew the truth then. We can't fight them up there. That's their sky now." That phrase, "that's their sky now," began appearing in pilot reports with disturbing frequency. Japanese airmen who had dominated Pacific skies in the early war years were confronting a new reality where altitude itself had become enemy territory. The Americans hadn't just built a better bomber. They had created an aircraft that operated in a different dimension of warfare, one where Japanese forces couldn't effectively contest. Commander Tanaka began calculating the resource disparity that made such aircraft possible. Each B-29 required approximately 18,000 man-hours to manufacture. The United States was producing them at a rate of roughly 100 per month by late 1944, with production accelerating. That represented 1.8 million man-hours per month dedicated to just this one aircraft type. Japan's entire aircraft industry, across all types and manufacturers, couldn't match half that labor investment. And the B-29 was only one part of America's air armada. The fuel consumption was equally staggering. Each B-29 carried over 8,000 gallons of fuel for a maximum range mission. A single raid of 100 bombers consumed 800,000 gallons. The entire Japanese military was rationing fuel so severely that training flights were being reduced to minutes. Pilots were practicing maneuvers while parked on the ground, and obsolete aircraft were being converted to gliders to save fuel. America was burning in single raids what Japan couldn't accumulate in weeks.
But perhaps most psychologically devastating was the reliability factor. American bombers that were damaged but still flyable would return to base, be repaired, and fly again days later. Japanese interceptors damaged in combat
often became total losses because spare parts were unavailable, manufacturing capacity was overwhelmed, or maintenance facilities lacked necessary equipment. The Americans treated their highly sophisticated heavy bombers as repairable, reusable assets. Japan was beginning to treat its fighters as expendable, single-use weapons that happened to have pilots attached. Commander Yuki Tanaka stood on the rooftop of Imperial Naval Headquarters on December 13, 1944, watching smoke rise from the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant across the city. Another B-29 raid had struck that morning, and this time the bombers had carried something different: incendiary clusters. Firebombs designed not to destroy through explosive force, but to burn everything they touched. The plant was still burning 6 hours after the raid ended, and fire crews were losing the battle against flames that seemed to feed on the winter wind itself. She understood now that America wasn't just attacking Japan's war production. They were demonstrating that they could burn Japanese cities to ash whenever they chose, and there was nothing Japan could do to prevent it. The intelligence reports crossing her desk had taken on a desperate quality. Fighter pilots were being ordered to ram B-29s if they ran out of ammunition, a tactic that acknowledged Japanese aircraft couldn't effectively damage the bombers through conventional attacks. Anti-aircraft gunners were reporting that shells exploded below the B-29 formations, unable to reach the altitudes where the Americans operated. Radar operators tracked the bombers from hundreds of miles away, but could only watch helplessly as they approached, struck their targets, and departed untouched. Every system designed to defend Japan was failing simultaneously, and everyone knew it. Lieutenant Kenji Hayashi brought her an intercepted American weather report that made her blood run cold. The transmission, sent in clear language without encryption, casually discussed weather conditions over Tokyo for the next 72 hours. Wind speeds at 30,000 feet, cloud cover predictions, temperature inversions. The Americans weren't even bothering to encrypt their weather forecasts because they knew Japanese forces couldn't stop them regardless of advance warning. That casual arrogance, that absolute confidence that Japanese defenses were irrelevant, communicated strategic dominance more effectively than any propaganda. She thought about her younger brother, Hiroki, who was training as a kamikaze pilot at a base in southern Kyushu. He was 19 years old, barely out of school, and he had perhaps 30 hours of flight training before he would be sent on his final mission. 30 hours. American B-29 pilots trained for over a year before their first combat mission, accumulating hundreds of hours in increasingly complex aircraft. They practiced high-altitude bombing runs, navigation across open ocean, emergency procedures, evasive maneuvers against fighters. Japanese pilots, like her brother, learned basic takeoff and landing, perhaps one practice attack run, and then they were given a plane loaded with explosives and pointed toward an American ship.
The contrast wasn't just about training time. It was about fundamental assumptions. America trained pilots expecting them to survive, to learn from experience, to become more skilled through repeated missions. Japan trained pilots expecting them to die on their first flight, to accomplish one mission through sacrifice rather than skill. One approach treated pilots as valuable assets to be developed and protected. The other treated them as ammunition to be expended. Commander Tanaka couldn't stop wondering which approach reflected greater respect for the young men involved. Captain Nakamura summoned her to a classified briefing on December 18th. The room was filled with senior intelligence officers, all wearing expressions of barely concealed anxiety. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, entered, and everyone stood at attention. When he gestured for them to sit, Commander Tanaka noticed how much older he looked than his official photographs. The weight of defending an indefensible position was visible in the lines around his eyes. The Admiral's briefing was remarkable for its honesty. "Gentlemen, and Commander Tanaka," he nodded in her direction, acknowledging the sole woman in the room, "we are gathered to discuss a reality that cannot be shared beyond this room. The American B-29 offensive represents a strategic threat we cannot counter with available resources.
Our fighter aircraft cannot effectively operate at the altitudes where these bombers fly. Our anti-aircraft artillery cannot reach them. Our early warning systems give us time to sound alarms but not to mount effective defenses. In short, we can watch them come and we can count the damage after they leave, but we cannot stop them. The room was silent. These were men accustomed to projecting confidence, to speaking of Japanese spirit and inevitable victory. Hearing an admiral admit helplessness was like watching a temple collapse. Admiral Toyota continued, his voice heavy with fatigue. Intelligence estimates suggest America will have over 1,200 B-29s operational by summer of 1945. 1,200 aircraft, each capable of carrying 10 tons of ordnance. If they choose to systematically destroy our cities, we cannot prevent it. The only question is whether they will use explosive bombs or incendiaries, and how long our population can endure before civilian morale collapses completely. Commander Tanaka raised her hand, a breach of protocol in such a senior meeting, but Admiral Toyona nodded for her to speak. "Sir, what does this mean for our strategic planning? If we cannot defend our cities or our industry, how can we continue the war?" The Admiral's smile was sad and knowing. "That, Commander, is precisely the question the Americans want us to ask. They are not trying to defeat us militarily in the traditional sense. They are demonstrating that continuing the war is pointless because they can destroy everything we value while remaining safely beyond our reach. It is psychological warfare conducted at 30,000 feet. That night, Commander Tanaka couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her brother, Hiroki, about the thousands of young pilots training to die in single desperate attacks, about cities full of civilians who couldn't evacuate because there was nowhere to go, about a war that everyone with access to real intelligence knew was already lost. She thought about the American bomber crews, flying their sophisticated aircraft in heated, pressurized comfort, probably listening to music on radios, perhaps playing cards between bomb runs, treating warfare like a difficult but manageable job rather than a sacred death mission. The next major raid came on Christmas Eve. The symbolism wasn't lost on Commander Tanaka. While Americans celebrated their religious holiday, likely with special meals and gifts and time with family, they sent 75 B-29s to bomb Nagoya's aircraft factories. The raid was devastatingly effective, destroying 3 manufacturing facilities and killing over 200 workers. But the psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. The Americans had demonstrated they could attack on any day, holiday or not, because their industrial machine didn't pause for celebration. Japan, which had mobilized every resource, including children collecting pine roots for fuel, was fighting an enemy that could afford to maintain peacetime holidays while waging total war. Commander Tanaka obtained a translated copy of an American newspaper from January 1945, smuggled through neutral channels. The article discussed B-29 operations with casual detail that would have been classified in Japan. It mentioned that crews typically flew missions every 3 to 4 days, with 1 week off per month. It described base facilities in the Marianas that included movie theaters, baseball fields, and well-stocked mess halls. It noted that bomber crews received steak dinners before missions as a morale boost. The newspaper treated these details as routine, barely worth mentioning, just normal aspects of military life. She compared that article to conditions at her brother's kamikaze base, details she'd learned through family letters, carefully worded to avoid censorship. Pilots slept in unheated barracks. Food was rice and vegetables when available, often less. Training was conducted using obsolete aircraft because modern fighters were too valuable to risk in practice. The final meal before a suicide mission was whatever the base could scrounge. Ceremonial sake if they were lucky, but often just tea and rice balls. American crews got steak before missions they expected to survive. Japanese pilots got rice balls before missions designed to kill them.
The bombing campaign intensified through January. American planners had clearly shifted from experimental raids to systematic destruction. Each raid involved more bombers, struck more precisely, caused more damage. Japanese defenses adapted as best they could, developing new tactics and strategies, but adaptation without resources was merely rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. Fighters tried diving attacks from above, but the B-29s flew too high for effective diving runs. They tried coordinated group attacks, but the Americans' defensive fire was too accurate. They tried night attacks to avoid the bombers' gunners, but American navigation was so precise they could strike targets in darkness. Commander Tanaka compiled statistics that told a story of escalating disaster. In November 1944, B-29s flew approximately 500 sorties against Japan. In December, 800. In January 1945, over 1,200. Each sortie represented a bomber carrying 5 to 10 tons of ordnance, flown 3,000 miles round trip by crews who expected to return home for dinner.
The mathematics of destruction were relentless and accelerating. At current rates, American bombers would drop over 10,000 tons of explosives on Japan in February alone, more than the total tonnage Japan could deliver against all targets worldwide. She interviewed survivors from the bombed cities, trying to understand civilian morale and psychological impact. A schoolteacher from Nagoya named Keiko Watanabe described the progression of emotions during raids. At first, we felt defiant, she explained, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the siren sounded, we would shake our fists at the sky and curse the Americans. We believed our soldiers would protect us, that our spirit would prevail. But after the third raid, the fourth, the 10th, something changed. We realized the Americans could bomb us whenever they wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do. The defiance turned to resignation, then to despair. Now, when the sirens sound, people just sit quietly and wait to see if they'll survive. We don't shake our fists anymore. We've accepted that we're helpless. That acceptance, that psychological surrender, even while the war continued, was spreading through Japan's urban population like a disease. Commander Tanaka recognized it as the strategic objective behind the bombing campaign. America wasn't trying to kill every Japanese citizen or destroy every factory. They were demonstrating overwhelming power so consistently that resistance seemed pointless. They were breaking will rather than breaking armies, and it was working. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, represented a catastrophic escalation that shattered any remaining illusions. Commander Tanaka was off duty at her family's home in the suburbs when the raid began shortly after midnight. From her bedroom window, she watched the eastern sky turn orange, then red, then a brilliant, terrible gold as the fire spread. 325 B-29s dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs on the most densely populated area of Tokyo, creating a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of the city. The heat was so intense that water in the canals boiled. The winds created by the fire were strong enough to tear roofs off buildings miles from the impact zone. People who fled into the rivers to escape the flames were boiled alive or drowned in the crush of other refugees. Those who stayed in their homes were incinerated. Those who ran through the streets were caught by walls of fire that moved faster than they could flee. By dawn, over 100,000 people were dead, mostly civilians. Over 1 million were homeless. The single deadliest air raid in human history had just occurred, and it had taken one night. Commander Tanaka reported to headquarters at daybreak, her uniform covered in ash from the still-burning fires. The intelligence office was chaos. Communication lines were down across half the city. Casualty estimates were climbing every hour. Fire crews had given up trying to fight the blazes and were simply evacuating survivors from areas not yet burning. The scope of destruction exceeded anything anyone had imagined possible. Captain Nakamura looked like he'd aged a decade overnight.
"We have to evacuate the Emperor," he said without preamble when she entered. "The Americans have demonstrated they can burn Tokyo to ash in a single night. If they choose to do it again and again, there won't be a capital left to defend."
The firebombing broke something fundamental in Japanese military psychology. For years, propaganda had assured the population that the homeland was impregnable, that American bombers couldn't reach Japanese cities, that even if they did, the damage would be minimal, that Japanese spirit would overcome material disadvantage. One night of fire had revealed all of it as lies. The Americans could reach Tokyo, the damage was catastrophic, and spirit couldn't extinguish flames that melted steel and boiled water. Commander Tanaka watched the city burn for 3 days. The fires were too intense, too widespread to fight effectively. They simply had to burn themselves out, consuming everything flammable until only ash and twisted metal remained. She walked through the devastated areas, documenting the destruction for intelligence reports. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, leaving only foundations and chimneys standing like gravestones. Schools were gone, hospitals were gone, markets, temples, homes, all reduced to gray ash that the wind blew into drifts like snow. She found a young mother sitting in the ruins of what had been her home, holding a burned photograph of her children. The woman looked up at Commander Tanaka with empty eyes and asked a simple question that had no answer. Why? Why did they do this? What military target requires burning children alive? Commander Tanaka had no response that would provide comfort. She knew the strategic rationale, the arguments about destroying war production located in residential areas, the calculations about breaking civilian morale. But standing in the ashes, looking at this mother's devastated face, all the strategic logic seemed hollow. The bombing campaign continued with relentless intensity through the spring. Osaka was firebombed on March 13th, killing 4,000 and destroying 8 square miles. Kobe was hit on March 16th, destroying 3 square miles and 20,000 homes. Nagoya was struck repeatedly through March and April. The pattern was clear and terrifying. American planners had shifted from precision bombing of industrial targets to area bombing of entire cities. They were systematically burning urban Japan city by city, and Japanese defenses remained utterly inadequate to stop them. Commander Tanaka compiled intelligence that revealed the scope of America's plans. Captured documents and interrogated prisoners indicated the United States had identified 67 Japanese cities for potential firebombing, 67 cities marked for systematic destruction. The Americans weren't hiding their intentions. They were openly preparing to burn the country until Japan surrendered or until there was nothing left to burn. The choice was Japan's to make. Her brother Hiroki wrote one final letter before his kamikaze mission in April. She received it a week after learning he had died, his plane shot down by American fighters before he could reach his target. The letter was heartbreaking in its quiet resignation. "Sister," he wrote, "I know now that we cannot win this war. I know that my death will accomplish nothing except to satisfy the honor of commanders who sent us here. I know that America is too strong, too rich, too advanced for us to defeat. But I will fly my mission anyway, because to refuse would dishonor our family and betray my fellow pilots. I die not believing in victory, but believing in duty. Please remember me as I was, not as this war has made me." His words haunted her. This young man sent to die in a war already lost, sacrificed not to achieve victory, but to maintain the illusion that honor could substitute for hope. By summer 1945, Japan's urban population had been devastated. Over 60 cities had been bombed, most multiple times. Conservative estimates put civilian deaths at over 300,000, with millions more homeless. Industrial production had collapsed. Transportation networks were disrupted. Food distribution was failing. The B-29s had accomplished in 6 months what years of Pacific Island combat couldn't achieve. They had brought the war home to Japan in terms so overwhelming that further resistance seemed suicidal rather than heroic. Commander Tanaka attended a classified briefing in late July, where Admiral Toyoda finally stated what everyone knew, but no one would say publicly. "The war is lost," he announced to the assembled officers. "We have no effective defense against American strategic bombing. Our cities burn at their pleasure. Our industry is crippled. Our people are starving. Our military has been reduced to sending boys on suicide missions because we lack the resources for actual combat operations. The only question remaining is how many more must die before we acknowledge reality." The room erupted in argument. Traditionalist officers insisted that surrender was impossible, that Japanese honor required fighting to the last citizen. Pragmatists countered that honor was meaningless if the nation ceased to exist. Some argued that the Soviet Union's entry into the war would change the strategic situation. Others pointed out that adding another enemy to the list simply made Japan's position more hopeless. Commander Tanaka listened to the debate, thinking about her brother, about the mother in the ashes, about the millions of civilians who would die if the war continued. She stood, another breach of protocol, but Admiral Toyoda nodded for her to speak. "Sirs, the Americans have already demonstrated the war's outcome. They bomb us from altitudes we cannot reach, in numbers we cannot match, with resources we cannot imagine. They have shown they can burn our cities at will. The B-29 isn't just a weapon, it's proof that we lost this war before it began because we never had the industrial capacity to match them. Every day we continue costs thousands of lives for an outcome already determined. The question isn't whether we can win, it's whether we have the courage to acknowledge we cannot, and the wisdom to save what remains of our nation and people." The room fell silent. She had said what everyone thought but feared to voice. Admiral Toyoda looked at her with something like relief. "Commander Tanaka has stated the essential truth," he said quietly. "The B-29 campaign has accomplished what the Americans intended. It has shown us that continuing this war means accepting the destruction of everything we claim to be protecting. That is the genius of their strategy. They don't need to invade. They just need to keep burning until we recognize the inevitable." The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August merely confirmed what the B-29 conventional bombing campaign had already proven. America possessed overwhelming technological and industrial superiority. Japanese defenses were obsolete. Continuing the war meant accepting genocide by fire or atomic light.
When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, Commander Yuki Tanaka felt not shame but relief. The nightmare was finally ending. The bombers would stop coming. The cities would stop burning. The young pilots would stop dying from nothing. Years later, when historians asked her about the B-29 campaign's impact on Japanese military thinking, Commander Tanaka's answer was simple and devastating. "The B-29 taught us that wars are won in factories and laboratories long before the first shot is fired. Japan brought courage and spirit to a contest of industrial production and technological advancement. We believed suffering made us strong. America proved that strength meant never having to suffer at all. They flew in comfort at 30,000 feet while we scraped for fuel on the ground. That altitude difference was the war in miniature. We couldn't reach them, but they could always reach us. Everything else was just mathematics and time." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.
And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.